Hello, I'm very happy to introduce Professor Peter Krapp of University of California, Irvine. I think Peter is the first lecturer we've had here who has an appointment in the humanities, social sciences, and engineering at the same time, right? So he's a professor of film and media studies in the School of Humanities. I was going to kind of count that as a social studies thing in a way, communication. He's also has an affiliate appointment in Informatics in the Donald Bren School of Information and Computer Sciences, so that's the engineering part. And then he's a professor of English in the School of Humanities at UC Irvine. Peter's also been very involved in university governance. Every time I run into him, he tells me that he's chairing 2 or 3 departments or running searches or all sorts of things like that. He's a very busy man. He's also been involved at the University of California level. And like all academics, he's written a bunch of books, but I want to emphasize just one book, which I think is a fantastic book on a very different sort of topic. It's called Noise Channels, Glitch and Error in Digital Culture from University of Minnesota Press in 2011. I really recommend that book. Run out and get it right now after the lecture. Okay, with no further ado, Peter Krapp.
Thank you very much for having me here. Nice to meet you. If you're in the last row, I'm likely to come by you and introduce myself in more detail. It's a bad habit of teaching. And I'm really touched, Henry, that you mentioned the affliction that I have and getting involved institutionally. And a little bit of that might come through in this talk as well, because I want to figure out, if you're, is there anybody who plays MMOs, RPGs? Is there somebody who's never played any kind of online role play? There are a couple of people. Okay. So, I'll go over some of the basics, but, because there's a couple of people who raised their hands. But they're approximating institutional structures, right? They're self-governing to a certain extent, but they're also a business. And they're also a social and other kind of structures. So the computer game studies major that we have at Irvine graduated its first students a year and a half ago. And I helped start that. And we're teaching a bunch of classes on games, on game studies from different perspectives, as you said, from a engineering or computer science perspective, from a social science perspective, from a communication perspective. This is mostly going to be sort of an analysis of the stakes, the values. Why would something as apparently innocuous and apparently non-serious, maybe even, as playing an MMO, playing with other people online, playing with a computer with other people, give rise to a response, a very robust and organized response by not one, but at least 2 very powerful state agencies. So the question really is, are massively multiplayer online games and virtual worlds potential havens for activities that require a systemic response in the name of national security, in the name of securing that space? And that's the question that was raised and is belatedly turned out rather extensively explored by more than one security service over the past decade. The rise of online gaming not only changed the way we think about role-playing, but also transformed the strategy genre. And beyond these genres, network computing also spawned virtual worlds that are not strictly speaking games, but venues for congregating, exploring, communicating, and for commerce, for trade. They all rely on data flows that are minutely logged and analyzed, not only by the publishers of such games and by the virtual worlds themselves, by the operators, by the publishers, by the developers, who have an obvious interest in monitoring them for operation and feedback, but also, it turns out, by secret services who include the UK's GCHQ and the NSA here in the United States. Just what they see in online games and virtual worlds can be instructive for those of us interested in games in particular and in computer culture in general. In part, this is a logical step right? If you think about these things just as communication networks of a new kind, a new flavor, much like the telephone or any kind of communication platforms, virtual worlds and online games enable conversations, enable transactions. But beyond this mediation, state agencies began to worry very specifically that virtual worlds may be a potent means, I quote, a potent means of spreading values and ideologies. All right, so if you look back only 10 years ago, which to many of you might be half a lifetime, but to me seems like, less than the time I've spent thinking about these kind of things. Plenty of room, leg room. Is it something where we have to suspect terrorist groups or other kinds of subversive activities are using MMOs? One government-sponsored study of intelligence gathering in virtual worlds surmises, I quote, given that the more sophisticated groups of this type, including Al-Qaeda, have exploited the internet, exploited in very refined ways, they will likely soon seek to exploit newer virtual world technologies for recruiting, raising, and transferring funds, training new recruits, conducting reconnaissance and surveillance, and planning attacks by using virtual representations of prospective targets, end quote. Right, so a little of this became known a decade ago, and the bulk of what I'm going to talk about became only known with the Snowden leaks, with the revelations at the end of 2013, that GCHQ and NSA have been collaborating on a very, very massive systematic inspection of all kinds of traffic, of all kinds of communication over the internet. That would include, obviously, MMOs, although we're not quite sure yet why MMOs should be suspect. But I'm going to give you a couple of stock photographs. I did not fly over GCHQ myself, but mostly the slides and the rest of the talk will be taken from some of these documents that were leaked by Edward Snowden, or documents that have come out through the Federation of American Scientists, FAS, which is an organization that looks to counteract some of the overclassification, some of the overzealous classification by the United States government. So they started with nuclear policy and other kinds of high policy questions, but they've also gone into cyber policy. So not everything that I'm going to show you is lifted from a top secret classified document, but some of them are. So if you or somebody you're related to has a problem with that, close your eyes or tell the camera to swerve away from those. GCHQ collaborates with the NSA, and they have a joint base, MHS, Monmouth Hill Station, and that was going to be one of the hubs. Here's one of those top secret documents I warned you against. I don't know if you do trigger warnings at Stanford. We don't at UC Irvine, but this is sort of my political equivalent of, trigger warning. So the premise is, we know that terrorists use many feature-rich internet communications media for operational purposes. Therefore, we must seriously look at games and virtual environments. So the data mining dragnet here reaches the playing fields of elves and trolls. But despite focusing on World of Warcraft and Second Life as pivotal examples, this report and others also discusses the virtual worlds for preteens as Barbie girls, Webkins, Club Penguin. Don't worry, I'm not going to always have you raise your hands if you're too embarrassed to admit that you know what these things are. My son, who's now 15, has looked at all of those. There are also more casual game environments that they wanted to inspect, like MapleStory, There.com, and Spore, all of which are multiplayer online platforms, either for play or for virtual world exploration. In fact, the scope of this study sought to encompass the history, demographics, and play characteristics of over 200 virtual worlds and online gaming environments that they surveyed in 2008. Right, while this systematic exploration and exploitation of virtual worlds by intelligence and security branches of various governments has received some journalistic coverage, these issues of secrecy and surveillance in virtual worlds are rarely being addressed in academia. So if we define a virtual world or an MMO as a computer environment offering a dynamic representation that invites and fosters immersive interaction, rather than merely audiovisual processing or haptic and kinesthetic processes, we may say that they stimulate the senses, activate cognitive processes in ways that enable and encourage certain exploratory, collaborative, or competitive interactions. As one scholarly definition has it, virtual worlds are immersive, simulated, persistent, and dynamic environments that include rich graphical three-dimensional spaces, high-fidelity audio, motion, viewpoint, and interactivity. And they have gained legitimacy in business and educational settings for their application in globally distributed work, project management, online learning, and real-time simulation. Right? So right away you see that when you look at it this way, it's not just a thing that you do instead of homework in middle school. It's not just a thing that you do with your guildies on the weekend. It's something that potentially could be giving rise to organized activities of a kind that maybe need to be looked at by security organizations. So these clusters of features and capabilities aroused the worry that led to a number of incursions by state agencies and their contractors into virtual worlds and online games. But it's not only the fact that people share experiences or communicate synchronously or asynchronously or whatever you do in MMOs and virtual worlds, they can serve as an adversarial stage. You can actually play against another group. So it won't surprise you now anymore that both agencies actually did a number of things, including signing up to play several of these, probably not all 200, and trying to capture the data flow. Right? Because it turns out that in 2007, 2008, when they first came out with these challenges, they couldn't distinguish between that kind of traffic and any other kind of traffic. In fact, if they could identify that this is Blizzard's World of Warcraft lead speak channel, they couldn't necessarily read what this kind of channel presents. So until very recently, most expert commentators on MMORPG play implicitly or explicitly assumed that MMOs present a conceit that the virtual world is separate from the real world, as Richard Bartle, for instance, has it. And although players are aware that their virtual world is part of reality, they so want for it to be separate that they're prepared through strength of will to treat it as if it were. Inversely, here you have two large agencies, very well-funded state agencies, kind of looking at it exactly the other way around. So while game designers rarely break the covenant with their players, but maintain as well as they can what anthropologists and psychologists call frames, or what in game studies we might call the magic circle. Right? We're just playing here. This is not real. I'm not an orc. I'm not a troll. I'm not an elf, etc. But I'm role-playing as if. Right? It turns out it's not just people, especially teenagers, who love to role play, to as if. Computers are particularly good at the what if, the simulating of certain kinds of circumstances. So that's why there's the worry that these kinds of scenarios can be used not just to suspend disbelief in reality or belief in reality, but to train, to congregate, to communicate, and to do other kinds of things that might lead to suspect activities. So this intrusion of human intelligence and signal intelligence methods into the virtual worlds of make-believe may at first blush seem like a rough disruption of the shared illusions that gamers indulge in, but arguably the penetration of state security and surveillance into this realm of make-believe can neither be entirely unexpected nor completely incompatible with the nature of online games. It's really an old cliche that espionage is the great game, right? And it certainly could be argued that this global surveillance and subsequent big data parsing of certain patterns in virtual worlds and online games is a kind of strategy game in itself. I mean, this kind of slide showing you the Five Eyes capabilities. You know, the Five Eyes means, you know, 5 countries that collaborate: Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, UK, Canada, that have stations everywhere. It's something that you could be encountering in any kind of strategy game map or role-play game map. So either way, you require the highest possible quality of real-time information, as well as lots of planning and foresight, and a mix of stealth and aggression to carry out these resulting plans. If there's a pervasive culture of clandestine and covert surveillance of online games and virtual worlds, you can have a couple of different responses. I don't know if anybody has like a first gut reaction. Right? You can say, well, fundamentally, we're going to see this as a philosophical, moral, legal problem. Or fundamentally, we're going to be pragmatic about it and say, yes, if there are some Al-Qaeda or Daesh or whatever operatives that use PlayStation Network, we don't want them to be unobserved. Right? So while I go on through a couple more slides, I'm going to come back to this point. Think about where you might fall on the spectrum, saying, you know, I want play to be a sacred activity that's done only for its own sake. I want play to be not interrupted by suspicion, by worry, by, you know, not undermined by all of these other concerns. Or you can say, I want games, I want play to be something that can be looked at if there is enough pragmatic reason to think that these technical and social dynamics have an element to it that we want to inspect. You could argue, if you're in the first camp, right, the sort of moral or legal argument, that a pervasive culture of clandestine and covert surveillance of online games and virtual worlds is in direct contravention, at least of international human rights law. Human rights law. Right? Not every state subscribes fully to human rights law. Come on in. There's somebody knocking. Must be a human rights lawyer. But so, you know, it's law, but it's not necessarily a law that every country is going to fully uphold, right? So let's be clear about that. But it's very clear that the Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights both clearly state in the same formulation, I quote, "No one shall be subjected to arbitrary and unlawful interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to unlawful attacks on his honor and reputation." And further on that, everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. If it looks like I'm pointing to the slide, right? I mean, you know, you could make the case, you know. Even if one didn't hold that online games and virtual worlds belong to the sphere of correspondence included in these declarations, you know, basic human rights, the extent to which privacy is implicated needs to be discussed, needs to be unfolded a little bit. But of course, no news to anybody. Technology is a challenge for law and for law enforcement. That's not limited to internet communications. The law usually limps a decade or two behind technical developments. So you have technical realities that we deal with, not just here in the Bay Area, but globally, where there are no rules and regulations that fully comprehend them. Right? It takes a while for rules and regulations to catch up. But, for instance, if you think back to the 1990s, where the United States sought to combat digital and wireless communications that can hamper surveillance, Congress passed the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, which requires communications carriers to assist with authorized electronic surveillance. The reason why somebody like Edward Snowden, who worked as a contractor for the CIA and NSA and then absconded from his post in Hawaii with a lot of files, did that was because he felt that these files show that the agencies he was working for and the defense contractors, you know, including Booz Allen Hamilton that he was working for, went far beyond that. And if you read the newspapers yesterday, just yesterday and over the weekend, in the United Kingdom, a similar kind of discussion, of course, took place. And courts announced over the weekend in Britain that for at least 10 years, GCHQ, the government communications headquarters, which is their spy agency with a technical emphasis, had gone against at least European human rights law, if not existing British law. Now, in the UK, the legal situation is very different from the United States, but they both refer to a similar kind of framework by saying, the agencies have significantly overstepped the understanding by legislators and by the public and by the press of what they should be allowed to do and what they should perhaps not do in pursuit of these kinds of activities online. So it's totally unclear, even though Blizzard, for instance, operator of World of Warcraft, which at least at some point was a world record-setting place for participation in MMOs. They used to be on our Irvine campus. They've built their own campus still in Irvine. I know plenty of people there. I've been asking them. Nobody there wants to say on the record whether they've been approached by anybody or whether there is any kind of way that they could have been indirectly siphoning information about what's being communicated inside of World of Warcraft. But if you have people signing up for player accounts, even if they lapse or get banned for not actually playing but only listening into the chat, that gives you a window into it. And of course, World of Warcraft servers were run on the AT&T network, including the internet backbone, and the NSA was systematically looking there. So Blizzard is on a record as stating that they're unaware of any spying on World of Warcraft, but it is clear that these different media technologies can pose different potential or real security risks. So putting on my media studies hat for a moment, this is Stanford. We're in an engineering building, so I'm going to be really pretentious and put 3 formulas on the blackboard so that those of you who are hardcore Stanford students can come away thinking, I didn't listen to this humanities weenie for nothing. So networks, what kind of groups, what kind of dynamics, social and technical, are we talking about? It used to be that in the old days of networks understood as radio television networks, Sarnoff's law, named after a radio executive, was that the value of any kind of network is basically the number of all participants. Right? So if you have a clear channel radio station, if you have a big distribution network, the number of listeners, that's the value of your network. Simple, right? Because it's mostly a one-to-many kind of network. But then with packetized network communications and Metcalfe's law, which tries to understand what's different here in the internet age, the value of the network is proportional to the number of participants squared. And it's already the number of possible two-way conversations. Right? It's no longer a one-to-many medium. It's a many-to-many kind of communication. But arguably, some people say we're now in the age of Reed's law, where the value of a network, such as the MMO type network or any other kind of internet communication, actually is 2 to the power of n. Right? Then all the number of groups that can form in the network. Right? Theoretically unlimited number of groups that can form. Right? Now, if you're working for a place like GCHQ and NSA, I don't want to just dump on them. We have to have sympathy for them because, let's put them in the NSA. You come to them and say, never again can something like 9/11 be allowed to happen. Right? No pressure. Never again. Thou shalt not ever again allow something like that come to pass. Well, what can you possibly do if your official role is to understand anything that can possibly lead to those kinds of attacks, to those kinds of problems, to those kinds of challenges to the internal security of the United States. You can't stop at anything. You have to understand everything. You have to read, you have to listen to everything, right? No pressure, right? Go into all the possible groups that can be forming on any kind of communication platforms, right? So it's not maybe so totally ridiculous that they would want to sign up for World of Warcraft and Second Life and Webkins and so on, right? Because their job is to make sure that if there is any kind of organizing, training, recruiting, or influencing operation in any of these kinds of networks, you have to be there. And in fact, they claimed already in 2008, this is still from the GCHQ document, Al-Qaeda terrorist target selectors and executables have been found associated with Xbox Live, Second Life, World of Warcraft, and other games and virtual environments in pinwheel network traffic, in tailored access operations databases, and in forensic data. Now, these are just the equivalent of PR documents that Snowden took, right? We don't actually have access to the database, to the information that would back that up. But this study, marked top secret, says that there were selectors that they did find in these environments. Other targets include Chinese hackers, and Iranian nuclear scientists, Hezbollah, and Hamas members. Now you can say, oh, come on. Just because this nuclear scientist in Iran likes to play, I don't know, not Prince of Persia. What am I thinking? What do they play in Iran? Any kind of MMO, right? Doesn't mean that that's a way that they're communicating things that NSA or GCHQ needs to know. But it could be a vector through which NSA or GCHQ can understand what these people are up to, which is why they declare games and virtual environments are an opportunity. We can use them for exploits, social network analysis, human intelligence targeting, ID tracking, shaping activities, geolocation of target, collection of communications. There are other documents. I don't always want to draw on the same pilfered documents. It took 4.5 years for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to comply with the Freedom of Information Act request filed by Stephen Aftergood on behalf of the Federation of American Scientists in Washington, D.C. Aftergood, as I said at the beginning, is one of the most important voices in the debate around overclassification of government documents. He had requested a copy of the report, including a DVD, that resulted from a July 2008 ODNI summer hard problem here in the Bay Area, actually, on virtual worlds and their implication. Citing the National Security Act of 1947, the ODNI denied the DVD in full and released only a heavily redacted version of the discussions held in San Jose, California between July 13th and August 8th, 2008, ostensibly to protect the names and identifying information of ODNI personnel involved with this summer program called Cyberspace Spillover, where virtual games get real. However, as the call for the session explicitly states, the goal for this intensive 4-week study is to engage external non-government experts on an intractable program of significant national security interests. So the majority of participants would not have been ODNI personnel. Indeed, the composition of the study group comprised 13 government analysts and 17 external experts who came together, quote, to examine the intent and culture behind the use of virtual world technologies through research, simulation lectures, and peer-to-peer intellectual exchange. I've tracked down some of the non-government employees who participated. According to the redacted ODNI report that you can get online, 36 people participated, some of them providing material beyond the scope of the report that was appended to it. It's a long document. I wish we could just download the whole thing into your brains right now. It's sort of over 80 pages, very badly redacted so that, it's already a bad photocopy. There's a lot of gray blocks and then the black blocks on the gray blocks. But you'll see those slides coming up in a little bit. Parts of the report deal with basic aspects of virtual worlds, from the combination of graphics and networks to the formation of online identity to issues of virtual world economies and griefing. Other parts address the potential threats of compelling worlds with no social norms, virtual wars, and the exploitation of virtual worlds by political and religious extremists and terrorists. The forms of communication of interest to the ODNI and virtual worlds include messages typed and thus broadcast to avatars in the area, but also billboards, posters, advertisements, music or movies that can be broadcast in virtual worlds, and of course nonverbal communication methods, including but not limited to gestures. Think about that. You know? Yeah. Henry Lowood and Peter Krapp can get together and conspire to do any number of things without even talking in the game, without texting in the game. We can just use gestures. How is anybody going to capture that? Right? So there are a number of social scientists who were inspired by that session in 2008 to actually study gestures in a more systematic way. Now, 2008, I don't know how many of you were playing in 2008, but there are a lot of your avatars could not really execute any kind of gestures easily, which I know because I started looking at machinima, at making films inside of games at that time. Right? Often you have to carry a gun, right? So you have your BFG in the hand, and if you want to make your avatar nod, that's already kind of hard. You have to kind of like raise and lower the weapon in order to make the head go up and down. So there are limitations to the gestures, but still, it's a wide open question as to what do you do in order to capture gestures if they are meaningful. We all know that we communicate with gestures. I'm gesticulating right now. Of course, gestures are not always loaded with meaning. In fact, we tend to do these kind of things that are kind of empty of meaning, like I'm doing right now. They just mean, pay attention, I have a communication channel open. That's all they say, right? They don't say, attack the Shirham Center at noon. Yeah? It's hard to convey that in gestures alone. But it's something to think about. So here I am approaching the government agency of my choice, where you're not allowed to take pictures because they're extremely, let's say, controlling about their environment. And in the back, you see kind of an L-shaped building that's being taken down right now and replaced with a newer building because it's an agency that keeps growing in dollars and personnel headcount. They decided to collaborate with GCHQ on this effort, stating that although online gaming may seem like an innocuous form of entertainment, when the basic features and capabilities are examined, it could potentially become a target-rich communication network. So, like I said, MHS, you see on the top left, MHS, Menwith Hill Station, that's a joint operation by GCHQ and NSA. That goes back to the end of the Second World War when there was a collaboration on crypto technologies, including, of course, breaking Japanese and German communications that were secured, but also securing telephone communications, for instance, between Churchill and other officials in England and their counterparts in the United States. Communication, this says, is at the core of online gaming, and in World of Warcraft there are many ways to communicate and interact in the virtual world. A player has a character ID and can join different groups. A party brings players together, guilds, right, and it scales from there. So GCHQ recently asked Menwith Hill Station's new Mission Development Center to support an online gaming research effort focusing on World of Warcraft. The logs are now being forwarded back to GCHQ for additional analysis, target development, and network knowledge enrichment. By fusing information from different systems, databases, and resources, GCHQ has correlated target entities to WoW logon events and continues to uncover potential signal intelligence value by identifying accounts, characters, and guilds related to Islamic extremist groups, nuclear proliferation, and arms dealing. All right, so now you begin to understand it's not that necessarily you assume that we're using webkins to plot an attack on this engineering lecture hall, it's possibly that you know that she's very, very good at hiding her trails and traces online using all of the state-of-the-art technology when she's communicating with her co-conspirators. But she has the weakness for occasionally relieving pressure by playing World of Warcraft. And if an agency can correlate and say, that's the same person, and you now know she just logged into this game in this place from this IP address, now we have a location for you. Right? What does the slogan say? Metadata can kill. Right? So correlating data between different databases, that's where they wanted to go with this exploitation. All right, let's wind up. Realistic weapons training. This is seriously something that a decade ago, as primitive as these games are in terms of what kind of weapons you can do there, the belief is you can use games to train. You can use games to practice. Right? It's expensive to blow yourself up. You tend not to be there to do it a second time, so let's practice it in a virtual world. Right? It's expensive to use up resources, therefore let's train in a simulation. You can have navigation and terrain familiarization. You can have cooperation, not just flight simulator, which we know some of the 9/11 pilots used. They practice takeoff but not landing, but other kinds of games that can perhaps give rise to that level of training. So there are 3 levels of focusing. Right? An avatar can be a way of hiding. It can be you anonymous. But an avatar can also, and this is the one claim that I found really curious, and I wish we had an extra hour to talk about that. These agencies seriously feared that you could create, for instance, an Osama bin Laden avatar that could survive the actual person by 100 years and preach online and convert people or call them to action. I'm gonna just cut that topic off right now because I have several pages discussing it and I can't go into the detail now considering where we are in the day, but it's an interesting fear to have. A Donald Trump avatar that's going to forever say the kinds of things that he says. Right? You can't ever shut him up. A Hillary Clinton avatar, an Osama bin Laden avatar that's going to preach hate forever. On the second level, game action. Right? You can simulate and train. We all know that, yes, when you play a game, it trains you to use the system. Right? It installs the controls in you. On the other hand, you have to say it's more like writing. Yes, if I learn to write, I learn a system. But it doesn't mean that I have to take dictation from you. Yes, now I can write. I can take down words. But I can also write things of my own. Right? So maybe this kind of training is more like learning to swim. Right? Now you've learned to learn something. My body, very obviously, not designed to float. Right? Check it out. But I can swim. Right? Does that mean anything? No, I don't swim all that much. But learning to swim means that you've learned to learn something. Right? So you acquire the capability of learning other things. Right? So games are being used in pedagogical settings, including online learning, etc. The third level, these in-game interactions, such as communication, right? Maybe conspiratorial chat, etc., or segregating. Right? Our guild, our game studies-oriented guild is only going to talk to each other here. We have a private channel. There are 2 different approaches, if you want to be really rough about it. The signal intelligence approach, where you just tap the entire data stream and you just look through it. You try to find a certain kind of selector, her, right? Or any of you. Right? you're known by certain attributes. If we can find you in that data stream, then that adds to what we know about your activities. Versus human intelligence, where you literally have men in black sign up to be orcs or trolls and try to interact there to figure out what's going on. Is this something with potential? There's one more report that I quickly want to talk about, even though we don't have a lot of time to go into it. This is not a secret one. SAIC is one of the largest government contractors. It's a very systematic report. It's almost like a think tank study, a quasi-academic study of games. This is one of two unclassified US government reports. There's a project to develop ways to spot terrorists who use virtual worlds. There was a data mining project, very brief shelf life only, codenamed Reynard, that was described as a seedling effort to study the emerging phenomenon of social dynamics in virtual worlds and large-scale online games. It drew a lot of social scientists into it. Many of them have since disassociated with that. They don't want to be involved with this kind of effort. In fact, the entire American Anthropological Association has denounced working on that level for government agencies and said that's not what anthropology should be about. It should be about studying humans, not to exploit or manipulate them, not to look into influence operations. But Reynard was a study of about 15,000 players in 9 countries in 12 multiplayer online games and virtual worlds that started in 2009 and ended in 2012, aiming to determine behavioral indicators in the realm of massively multiplayer online games and virtual worlds that are predictive of real-world characteristics of the users. That's the big operative. Your behavior in-game, they stipulate, is predictive of your real game behavior, of your real-world behavior. And there's the SAIC document that plainly predicts, quote, if virtual world technology enters the mainstream, criminals and US adversaries will find a way to exploit this technology for illegal and errant behavior. They're headquartered in California, but they have a major presence in the DC area. They promote their ability to support intelligence collection in the game space. They've been doing these kinds of things before. They've won an initial $280 million 26-month contract to design a system called Trailblazer that was eventually going to run to $1 billion in 4.5 years and then abandoned. They actually drew up real terror scenarios for the Department of Defense using World of Warcraft to plan attacks on the DC area, for instance. I think I have a slide of that here. And they compare various games in, if you can see that, in their capacity to enable communication, to simulate and train, to maybe allow for money laundering, to spread propaganda and influence, and to recruit. Right? So you can see green ideal, yellow could be, red not effective. Now, many of you, if you're thinking about the games that you play, you might want to put red in many of these fields because really, if you want to recruit somebody to join any of these subversive terrorist organizations, there's probably a better place to find the likely recruits than MMOs. Right? It's questionable how effective these are, or first-person shooters, although it had to be tested. Most spy agencies' employees aren't exactly level 70 shamans, but these terror scenarios that they propose were quite serious. Where is it? Cyberspace spillover. I forgot to show you the slides while I was talking about them. You see, it's kind of hard to see, so you didn't miss anything. They're mining player data, they're gathering intelligence, and then they come up with the idea of having an overlay of the World of Warcraft chat and the DC area map, and they can have an in-game code that is consistent with what people are saying in-game, but that really means something else once you understand that this is a plot to act out a terrorist threat to the District of Columbia. So to come back to the questions that it raises for us in academia. Right? The first one is player privacy, the integrity of the game. If you're going to go systematically into World of Warcraft, many of the players are US citizens. They're not supposed to be targets of NSA surveillance unless an intelligence court specifically permits targeting them in person. So the legality of that program is one question. Blizzard, Microsoft, and Linden Labs declined to comment to the press about the extent of espionage on their games. Some of the customers were pretty angry. Some of the players, when this came out, some of the players were kind of amused. There's another NSA document from 2008 that describes games as a target-rich communications network. It's titled Exploiting Terrorist Use of Games in Virtual Worlds. And when that circulated, for instance, in WoW chat forums, people are like, really? I kind of pity the people that have to read through all of the stuff that you guys are saying. So it wasn't taken as a total outrage. Soon after some of these projects were initiated, there was a hearing on online virtual worlds in front of Congress. It led to the Civil Liberties and Privacy Office in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to kind of discontinue some of the projects pretty soon. So once we learned about this, when all of these schemes were revealed in early 2014, journalists had a field day mocking some of these efforts, but also couldn't really get very far because many agencies said, yeah, we started that in 2007 or 8, but it fizzled. So we're not going to tell you much about it because we really didn't learn much. You can take that as the honest answer at face value, saying, yeah, it was kind of a weird idea, and I'm not surprised that you didn't find much. Or you can be suspicious and say, you said that about a number of other programs. You said you discontinued them and then you just renamed them and continued them. So we don't know for sure. We don't know for sure. If you want to establish the intelligence value of World of Warcraft accounts, for instance, related to Islamic extremist groups or to nuclear proliferation or to arms dealing or to Chinese hackers, what have you, it turns out that when people did some digging, they found that there was a special group that had to be created to avoid collisions between the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA and GCHQ because they were kind of bumping into each other in these games. Rather than finding the suspects, they were just finding each other because those were the people who were behaving in an unusual way. So the reactions kind of were mostly jokes, some privacy concerns. The developers and publishers have been really mum about this. And in academia, we don't really have a full analysis, which is why I'm tempted to kind of poke at that and ask questions. There hasn't been any related changes in player behavior, although now that it's out in the open and people know that they're not anonymous, not unobserved, that might change their behavior already. Right? So that's the concern of privacy advocates. Now that you know that your cell phone tracks you wherever you are, maybe if you're going to go to a place where you don't want to be tracked, you leave it behind. Right? So you modify your behavior. Or now that you know that all phone records are being kept or analyzed, maybe you don't use your phone anymore, etc. So we don't know to what extent gamers have changed their behavior once they became aware that there's a systematic effort to have surveillance in that space. We also don't really know whether there's been any changes in the game design by the publishers and developers, either to secure against the siphoning of data or to make it easier. Right? There's a whole spectrum of responses that's possible. But there are clear consequences, right? So we don't have expectations of privacy when we play games. It does change what we describe as game management or game governance. And in a very large MMO with up to 10 million participants, it's a really big question. Who runs this place? Is it the guilds? Is it the players? Is it the developer? Is it the people who are trying to monetize the behavior? Or is it really the people who are sifting through your data with other questions in mind? So the rational expectations, as this report says, of privacy in virtual world evaporates. You can't really protect US citizens and their personal information in virtual worlds. And you have to kind of fall into one of these two camps, and I'm wondering where you are. If we open it up to Q&A. A principled criticism, sorry, there's a D missing. Principled criticism of surveillance that's mostly referring to legal or moral arguments, saying, this is really a burden on people. It's a burden on feeling free to explore, free to role play. My avatar is an old woman. Don't make conclusions to that. Don't think that means anything about me or my gender or how I perform being myself in real world or in the game world, etc. Or the pragmatic view that says states will need a persistent level of capabilities, defensive and offensive, so we can't exempt this. There's no corner of the internet, no corner of communications that can be exempt just because that's mostly devoted to fantasy. So let's be very clear. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act made it illegal to intentionally engage in electronic surveillance under the appearance of an official act. So many of these activities that we were finding out about belatedly went against those kinds of legal frameworks. The courts in the UK similarly have just said over the weekend, perfect timing for my visit here, that for at least 10 years GCHQ has broken existing law in doing this. They have found a convenient solution. They've simply changed the formulation of the law to get into compliance after the fact. And the Congress here in the United States is trying to do the same kind of thing. There's been an Amendments Act in 2008, around the same time that these activities started. But that amendment is scheduled to expire at the end of next year. So maybe you as gamers, empowered as you are as students at an elite university, can weigh in on that. It's clear that surveillance takes place at a much more basic level on the backbone of the internet, not just in the games. It's also clear that companies that provide access to these communications have sometimes been compelled or even sort of tricked into providing data. But it's an open question about what we do once we find out that these are the facts about this apparently innocuous fantasy realm that we call MMOs. Thank you. Any questions or comments?